The Honourable Member for Bay of Quinte.
Madam Speaker, speak softly but carry a big stick was the foreign policy of Theodore Roosevelt, American president in the early 1900s, which meant softly spoken diplomacy backed by something that can make your word count when it mattered and make it stick. And we may not have the largest military in the world, population or government, but we do have trade, resources, and IP, and all of those can be used to ensure we uphold this great nation. It allows Canada to maintain its democratic system while simultaneously expelling any acceptable state actors that threaten our democracy. And why does it matter? Because this country matters, and this country's place in the world because it's becoming increasingly more hostile. Canada has always been a beacon of hope, a pillar of democracy and freedom, alongside our allies, including Europe, the United States, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, among many others. But our democracy is under threat, and the threat has infiltrated the very democratic system that we hold incredibly dear, and this government has failed to protect Canadians from foreign interference from Beijing. There have been no less than 8 police stations set up in Canada to monitor our own citizens here in Canada. 11 MPs were influenced in nominations and elections. And 2 years ago, the member from Wellington Halton Hills had his family threatened and intimidated by a Beijing operative over a vote to denounce the treatment of Chinese Muslim Uyghurs in China. And this government allowed the perpetrator to remain in Canada for 2 years. This country, this Prime Minister, have allowed Canada to be in an abusive relationship with China. China takes advantage of Canada, which has resulted in a speak softly and carry a small stick foreign policy, or to allow China to treat Canada as the small potatoes nickname it calls our Prime Minister. And Mr. Speaker, China is taking advantage of Canada. If you want proof of that, well, we can only compare it to a survey entitled 5 Signs Your Partner is Taking Advantage of You. You be the judge. Number 1, you constantly make excuses for them. You frequently compromise on the things you want. You're afraid of confrontation with them. You often find yourself waiting around for them, and you pay for dinner almost every night. We constantly make excuses for them. You only need to look at the Hansard for the last few weeks to the government tripping over itself, making excuses for China, even so far as blaming the MP for Wellington Halton Hills for this fact that his family went through hell. It was his fault. It was the Leader of Opposition, who was the Minister of Democratic Reform, who didn't put stricter laws in place that would have restricted the Liberal government from being interfered with, they state. It's China. It's not China's fault. It's the Conservatives' fault. It's Canadians' fault. It's anyone but the Liberal government. We constantly make excuses for them when we shouldn't. 2, we frequently compromise on the things we want. Do you know that the biggest export from Canada is coal? For a government that talks about net zero and how great we want the environment to be and how much a better world we want to make, we ship coal that is just burned in China, and of course the winds just blow it back towards Canada. Does that sound like we're frequently compromising on the things we want? You know, we had a deal for vaccines with a company called CanSino in China. It was signed in May in 2020. And Canada put all our eggs in the basket. We said, this is going to be what saves us. We didn't go to Pfizer. We didn't go to Moderna at that point. We went to CanSino, and we signed a deal. And guess what? The deal fell through because China fell through because we're in an abusive relationship with China. $55 million we lost. I know this is small potatoes compared to almost billion we lost with Medicago and Novavax, but that was the first failed deal, the first of 3 failed deals, and it was with China. They promised we'd get vaccines. We promised we'd have them produced in a facility in Montreal in the summer of 2020, but China let us down because of this relationship. 3, we're afraid of confrontation with them. We took 2 years to kick out an agent who threatened a sitting MP in this House. Intelligence that went to CSIS and went to the Privy Council. Again, we're afraid of confrontation. We often find ourselves waiting around for them. Prime Minister had to wait for a meeting with the president of China. We do $100 billion of trade with China. We buy $100 billion, and yet when there was a G7 meeting, our prime minister had to go to a side room and didn't have really a meeting off camera, and then the president came back and said, you weren't supposed to have a meeting off camera, you weren't supposed to tell anyone about it, and the prime minister said, we respect the rule of law, but again, we are afraid of, we're waiting around for them, we're afraid of confrontation. This is an abusive relationship. And number 5, we pay for dinner every night. This trade relationship we have with Canada, we buy $100 billion worth of goods from China a year, and China buys, in response, $25 billion worth of goods per year. Madam Speaker, the analogy would be like you giving me $100, I give you $25 back, and saying that I had the better relationship with you, that I had the compromise. No, you're giving me $100. You have the relationship. You have the ability to set the compromises. It's a really sad situation. And the real question is, for Canada, the PM, what are we going to do to protect Canada's democracy, its people, its government, and MPs, their freedom, their democracy, our home, our values? And this government has failed its citizens in its basic duty to protect our values, our home. And if it wasn't for the Globe and Mail and Global News, reporters reporting accurately and honestly, and what is the litmus test for a free and democratic society, the freedom of the press, our democracy in this House would be worse off than it is now when it comes to protecting the values of our democracy. If it wasn't for His Majesty's loyal opposition and this government in waiting and this Prime Minister in waiting, we would be worse off than we are now. It has been this freedom of the press, not the government, that has truly protected Canadians by reporting accurately and honestly. Maybe too accurately and honestly. At the Liberal Convention this weekend, there was a motion passed that the Liberal Party of Canada requests the government explore options to hold online information services accountable for the veracity of material published on the platforms and to limit publication only to material whose sources can be traced, or in other words, if a Globe and Mail did not disclose its sources or Global News did not disclose its sources, these stories would never have been allowed to come out. Think about that for a moment. We're in this House today only because of the freedom of the press. Journalists Without Borders just demoted Canada. So think of this for a moment. From 5th in the world for freedom of the press to 22nd. That is really alarming. And is it only to protect this abusive relationship with China? The bigger conversation is that a government that promotes democracy should be prepared to face the consequences in protecting it. When this democracy is under threat, this doesn't seem to be the government that takes it seriously. The real question is, why do Canadians continually have to shame our government into action? If this government had a leader, that leader would stand up for the country and the democracy in which it represents. Perhaps the biggest question is, what are we afraid of? What are we afraid? Are we afraid of an open inquiry on foreign interference not headed by a former member of the Trudeau Foundation? Are we afraid of sending very bad actors, ones that threaten our very own MPs, packing? Why did it take 2 years and 2 weeks? Why are we afraid of shutting down and stamping out Beijing police stations with force if need be? Why are we afraid of setting up foreign registry like they do in the US and Australia? Are we afraid of defending our democracy, our people, our nation, and holding Canadians and Canada to the high standard we expect our government to? It's not you, it's me, Beijing. We can work together, but we will not put up with this abusive relationship. We don't capitulate to infiltration of our elections, our national security, to threats and intimidation to our citizens, our election officials. You know, when it comes to an abusive relationship, we can either get out of the relationship or you can improve it. And I think the first step when we're looking at an abusive relationship is to accept that we're in an abusive relationship and to tackle it head on. Open inquiry. I think every party in this House has asked for an open inquiry. Maybe it's better if we phrase it as counseling, right? Maybe we just need a new leader. To fix this abusive relationship, Madam Speaker, we need to stand up for Canadians. We need to speak softly. Diplomacy is very important, but we carry a big stick. We don't put up with abuse. We don't put up with compromise on our democracy. We certainly don't put up with allowing one country to infiltrate another, and we don't put up for democracy as a whole being threatened and putting down Canada, which we know is the #1 nation on this planet. To fix this abusive relationship, we need to stand up for Canadians, but Madam Speaker, perhaps what Canada really needs is a Prime Minister who will do just that. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, when I was sitting in the opposition benches, Stephen Harper went to China. And when he went to China, he brought back the panda bears, Madam Speaker. A commitment with the panda bears. What he didn't tell us is that he actually signed off on a secretive trade deal. So the member might want to reflect on that given the comments that he talked about trade, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell you, Madam Speaker,
The Honourable Member to ask his question.
Madam Speaker. And then when it comes in terms of foreign interference, it's really important to recognize, as I have, foreign interference has been taking place for many years, even when Stephen Harper was there. And Stephen Harper was aware of it. My question to the member is, how does he justify, whether it's the secretive trade agreement, whether it's Stephen Harper doing nothing, and then when the Prime Minister found out about it last week for the very first time, within a week, that diplomat was asked to leave the country?
For Bay of Quinte.
First of all, Madam Speaker, we've had a trade relationship with China because they are the second biggest economy in the world. And when Stephen Harper signed, it wasn't trade agreements, they were investment deals. It actually benefited Canadians to the point now where there's a massive trade deficit and Canadians aren't benefiting. Canadians are in an abusive relationship and are actually losing in this relationship to China under Prime Minister that's here now. So at the end of the day, you know, we have to have a nation that speaks softly, has diplomacy, sets up investment deals because that's good for Canadians and Canadian companies, but does not put up with Canadians being compromised, elections being compromised, our democracy being compromised. There's a difference, and our government knew that difference and we acted on it. This government does not.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for his speech. I had the pleasure of working with him on the Ethics Committee, and I like how direct he is and how he clearly summarizes issues. The Honourable Member, just a moment.
Colleagues to ask questions in silence, please. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. As a Bloc Québécois member, I'm always surprised to hear the members across the way explain what Mr. Harper did. Well, Mr. Harper clearly had a huge impact on politics because they refer to him very often. Now, the member said that at the Liberal convention, they adopted a resolution to censor media and said that that was dangerous. But how should we feel about a Prime Minister who takes information from the newspaper rather than from CSIS?
Well, thank you very much to my honourable member from the Belle-Provence. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
I think we're all very concerned that the fact that there's information that went through the proper channels and either the Prime Minister ignored it or he was incompetent in receiving that information on behalf of Canadians. We've been over this, and this is perhaps the most alarming part of the information we've received. The Canadians have been left in the lurch for 2 years. And this government's trying to figure out why, only based on the fact that the freedom of the press allowed information to come to the public. Otherwise, we'd be going out on our day dealing with an array of other issues right now on this government. So first and foremost, who knew and when? And we cannot believe that not the Prime Minister and a lot of other peoples didn't know. And certainly the first act is how do we fix that? And the only way to do that is through an open inquiry at this point.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Madam Speaker, well, I think we all agree that the member for Wellington Halton Hills has an incredible amount of integrity. What we don't see in terms of integrity is how the Conservatives are trying to exploit this. I'm amazed my colleague quotes Teddy Roosevelt. Is that what the Conservatives, they think the member for the Conservative leader is going to carry his big stick? You know, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, who launched illegal invasions in Cuba, Philippines, mass murder, based on falsehoods. But it's based on the Conservative belief that as long as Canadians don't know history, they're okay. So when it was Stephen Harper who was kissing up to China. What did they announce? They announced, and the member on the back bench can confirm this, they were going to send blueberries to China. Oh, we sent blueberries to China, and what did China take? China state corporations took control of a huge part of the oil sands. But Stephen Harper said that was okay, because they were sucking up to China. So for them to come in now with this false history is really, really concerning. They're exploiting a very serious situation in order to make their very juvenile leader look like he is going to walk out on the world stage with his big stick and take on China. Sure, Canadians deserve better than that.
A very brief comment from the Honourable Member for Bay of Quinte.
Canadians deserve a government that's going to stand up for them. And as I clearly noted, the big stick is our trade relationship. It's going to be able to ensure that we can encourage growth and investment, but also keeping out bad actors and bad company or countries that don't want to do bad things to Canadians. We're certainly going to do that. This Prime Minister, or the next Prime Minister, the opposition leader, is going to be a great Prime Minister who will do that for Canadians. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Caribou.